I'm in the middle of the how to sharpen just all the things video that I've been working on, and I've realised I have a couple of honing guides here and it would be probably more useful to have them in a standalone video to compare and contrast, see which sort of honing guide is suitable for you. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. I've got the generic Eclipse clone, the Veritas side clamping guide, and Veritas's Mk2 honing guide. And there are a few missing entries such as the Lee Nielsen or the Henry Eckert honing guides, but they are very expensive and they're very expensive. That's why I haven't got them, because that cost me too much money. And here's an uncomfortable spoiler. All three of these will get your chisel, plane, whatever you're sharpening, just as sharp as the other one. It really comes down to the other features and the ergonomics on each of them, whether one is good, bad, or otherwise. So this is an unmodified generic clone of the Eclipse number 36 honing guide. Eclipse are no longer in business as far as I know, but they certainly don't produce these anymore. You can find some vintage second-hand ones, obviously, honing guides on eBay and other places, but they may not be worth the money. You can find one of these for between 15 and 20 Australian dollary dues, and they will get the job done, but they may be a little bit tricky compared to some of the newer guides. You'll notice there is a clamping surface here, and also in here. Chisels and narrow blades go in the bottom. Chisels and narrow blades go in the bottom like so, and in the top section is where you'd put wider blades like plain blades. This will close all the way up, but you'd have to have a pretty wide chisel to be able to sit it in that section, and even then you may not be able to engage the sides of the chisel. There are two major complaints I have with a guide like this. The first is not very possible to fix, and that is this wheel. This is just a 1/2 inch wheel, I believe. Yep, 1/2 inch, or let's say 12.5 millimeters. Problem with that is it can be very rocky back and forth, so when you're trying to get a nice consistent bevel on your chisel, it will tend to roll on you and you may end up with a bit more of a camber than you mean to. The second issue, and this is why I said this was an unmodified one, is that these jaws, they are cambered to hold on to things, but they're not great. They're not necessarily straight enough to actually hold on to everything, and it can be a real issue to try and secure something in this. Oftentimes you will have to use a screwdriver to tighten up. That's not too much of an issue, but if you don't get it tight enough, the blade will slip. For setup, you can see on the side here it has instructions how far you need to project the blade to get what angle you'd like. So for chisels, it is 30 millimeters will give you a 30-degree angle, 40 millimeters will give you 25 degrees. However, a block like this is much easier for setup. I have a block at 40 millimeters for the 25-degree angle and 30 millimeters for the 30-degree angle. This one here is for the Veritas side clamping guide that we'll get to a little bit later. Chisel goes bevel up, jig goes on top of that, slide it until it butts up against it and tighten it down. Because of the machining on this, it wobbles around and I can still move it even though that was as finger tight as I could get it. Using the screwdriver, that's actually not that secure. Next up is the Veritas side clamping honing guide, which is new as of last year. It's very clear that Veritas have taken an old design and improved upon it by sort of reimagining it, whether it's with new modern materials or manufacturing, or just going, what works about this? How can we make it better? By that, of course, I'm talking about the Eclipse honing guide. It's roughly the same dimensions and it works the same way. You set the projection of your chisel or plain blade and you turn the screw to advance the side clamping jaws. There are a couple of very major differences. First off, the rods are quite a bit longer, means you can get wider chisels or plain blades in it, though I think the Eclipse is probably long enough. Next thing is the roller is considerably longer at about 1 inch, so twice the width of the Eclipse guide. This means in reality you can still rock and roll it, but it's a lot harder to do than on the Eclipse. Finally, we get to the top side of it and you can see quite a different design. There's still the 2 location jaw thingies, however either of them can be used for plain blades or for chisels, as this will close all the way up. So even the narrowest of chisels would still be caught in the top jaw rather than just the bottom one. Unlike the Eclipse, there is no guide for what you should set the projection to on the side of the honing guide. However, in the manual, there is positions here, that's in French. There's positions here. It is in imperial only. There is a link below for what the metric equivalent is of all these angles. However, this is still pretty useless because you're sort of meant to line things up. Yeah, it's just not great. Instead, the same block system that I've used here is still the best way to do it. The third block here is the Veritas top jaw for 25 degrees. Doesn't really matter whether you are referencing off the front or the back, and the process is exactly the same. Insert the chisel, slide it up to the guide, tighten with finger pressure, and unlike the Eclipse guide, that is nice and tight. I can't move that. However, if I really needed to, there is an Allen key socket to really torque down on that so that I can apply more pressure. The major downside of Veritas's version of the Eclipse guide is the price. It comes in at about 70 Australian dollars, so you're looking at 3 to 4 times more expensive than the Eclipse guide. So that's something you need to consider whether that is worth it to you or not. In my opinion, it is, because out of the box, one of these works and the other one doesn't. Other than the less than stellar location angle setting guide jig thingy, the only real complaint I have about this is the quality of the knurling on the thumbscrew is, for Veritas, actually quite low. It's perfectly acceptable, does the job, but compared to other Veritas tools that I own, it's really coarse and just isn't as comfortable in hand. Really not a major thing, but it is something to be aware of. Last of this batch, but certainly not least if we're looking at the price tags, is the Veritas Mk2 Honing Guide. This comes in at about 140 Australian dollar dues, and for a long time it was considered the most expensive option on the market. However, in recent years, between the Henry Eckert and the Lee Nielsen honing guides that go up to about 240 Australian dollars, this is quite the mid-range price all of a sudden. You may think $140 is crazy. What could this possibly do that the others don't? And I guess that's the key, that this actually does have some features that the other honing guides don't have. So it costs a bit more. First up, we'll look at some of the differences between them, and you can see the massive roller on the Veritas Mk2. It is about a 2-inch roller, or 50 millimeters. Compared to the other two, it just absolutely eclipses them. Next up, we have the angle setting fence, which is included with it, which means you don't need to build that stop board that the other two jigs require. This has 3 sets of angles on it, the high angle, standard angles and back angles, and those correspond with where you position the head, which can be adjusted up and down like so. Gives you a lot more flexibility in the angles you can sharpen a blade to. Though honestly, is that a highly needed feature? I can't say with great certainty. One really nice feature on the Mk2 is this micro adjust wheel. This will offset the wheel slightly. It's a cam knob there. When it's pointing up, that's at whatever angle you've set it to. Pointing, I guess 90 degrees, it is about a 1 degree, and point it straight down, so 180 degrees, and you've changed the angle by 2 degrees. This isn't an absolute must-have feature, but it is nice. I can set my angle to 25 degrees on my lower grit stones, and then without having to remove it from the honing guide, I can then just go to the higher angles by just adjusting one little knob, and it's just nice. The other thing to note about this is, unlike the other two where they clamp in from both sides, this is a top clamping guide. You can get just as good results, but there are a few little caveats with it. You need to be careful with when you're tightening the screws that you're doing it evenly so that you're not clamping on an angle. If you clamp on an angle, it tends to mean your blade is not overly secure. Let's go through the process of sharpening this to a 25 degree angle. Set the angle on the fence. I've got this set to number 2. Slide this on. It's about a 1-inch chisel, so I'm lining it up with a 1-inch mark here. And now I just need to evenly apply pressure, a little bit of pressure on each side at a time, and take the fence off, and we're good to go. As I mentioned, this is a top clamping honing guide, which has no problem with plain blades whatsoever, no problem with most chisels, but once you get below 10 millimeters or so, it can be a little bit tricky because you want to not put too much pressure on the blade, otherwise you do run the risk of really skewing it because it's not as secure as the side clamping guides for smaller chisels, small blades. Now to get around that, Veritas have made this quite the modular system, so you can buy a side clamping guide head for it rather than the top clamping one. You can also buy things like a cambered wheel if you're doing a lot of cambered blades. That's one major advantage over these side clamping ones, is that you don't really have an option. Whatever this is, you're stuck with that. In terms of posture and how you actually use it, I have 2 fingers on the blade. They're just applying light pressure to keep it down. If I let that up, it goes away from the stone. I'm not applying much pressure down. It's really just to defeat gravity, and all the thrust is being provided by my thumbs. There's a little ledge back here. Don't need to push or hold this very hard. The stone and the jig will do all the work itself. One key thing to avoid is grabbing the chisel handle. You have a lot of leverage, so it is actually relatively easy to move the blade around on an angle. It'll pivot around. And to apply even pressure to the chisel blade or plain blade, whatever you're sharpening, you don't want to apply too much pressure one way or the other. Alternatively, if you don't want to run that risk, you can just sort of hold it by the screws, just pushing down slightly on this to tilt the whole thing forward. Your thumbs are still doing all the pushing work. With the Veritas side clamping guide, the hand position is quite similar to the Mark II. Again, we've got the thumbs providing all the thrust in the guide, fingers on the blade holding it down. A little bit more pressure because of the balance point of this guide is much lighter, but I do tend to rest my hands on the bars, or bars on one side, screw on the other, and that's just to provide a bit more of a stable platform because again we've got that much narrower guide wheel. But overall the process is pretty much similar. It's a little bit less comfortable, but to be fair, I've had this for years, so I'm quite familiar with how it feels in hand. I'm sure I could adjust in no time to something like this. And finally, the Eclipse Honing Guide clone. This is going to be very similar to the Veritas side clamping guide. Again, fingers on the blade pushing down, thumbs on the back providing the thrust. Though I do find myself wanting to keep my hands a lot lower to try and maintain a little bit more control on the tilting action of this, because as I said, with that very narrow wheel it tends to want to tilt if you're not careful. Whereas when I'm up here I feel like I'm pushing it left or right constantly. To me this is the least comfortable, the extra length on the guide rods of the Veritas Honing Guide is a lot more comfortable to rest my hands there, and even more comfortable with the ledge in the back of the Mark II. So after looking at all 3 of these, which one would I recommend people buy if they're going for a honing guide? With any of these you can get stuff sharp, so I guess any of them is fine. It really depends on how much you value your time and fiddliness. I wouldn't personally recommend the Eclipse guide because it's chintzy, it's not stable, it's really fiddly to get to work. If you file it away so that it grabs things better and be a little bit less fiddly, but ultimately it's not comfortable for me to use. Your mileage may vary and it may be the best guide for you, but in my opinion it's not great. The other end of the spectrum is the much more expensive Veritas Mk2, and I really like this. If you are doing a lot of work with very narrow chisels, below 10 millimeters, and that's your primary sharpening task, I probably wouldn't get this, because unless you get the side clamping guide attachment for it, it isn't the best for narrow chisels, and frankly that's getting a little bit expensive. However, I do really like the larger wheel as well as the micro adjust feature, and for me, there's a reason why I've had this one for years and it'll definitely be staying in my collection. For me the surprise was the Veritas side clamping guide. It's not super cheap, but it's definitely not expensive. It's built really well and it handles a wide variety of blades sizes and it works well. I wasn't necessarily expecting this to be much more than a expensive Eclipse clone, but it does the job better and without fuss. So I think this would be my recommendation if you're looking for the cheapest option, and may still be my recommendation if you work primarily with narrow chisels, because it's a pretty good overall jig. The Mark II is also fantastic and it has the most range of options if you're willing to spend a bit more, but that comes entirely down to you. Hopefully this has been helpful for some people. Thanks for watching.